Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this doctoral defense. You might think that I'm going to give a lecture about relativity and the a priori, but I'm not going to do that. I am welcoming the main person in the room today, Claus Festersen, who will speak to that topic as part of your doctoral defense. I am Pro-rector at Roskilde University. I'm in charge of research and innovation, and this is a very special moment for us. It's a celebration, it's a feast. The outcome we will see towards the end of the afternoon, but just being here and welcoming you all is a special occasion for us. In the sciences, there is a big discussion going on since a long time whether we should do basic research or whether we should do more applied research. And I guess if you follow that dichotomy, you could argue that we are closer to the basic part than to the applied part. I would, however, contest that, and I think we should be careful about not accepting that dichotomy. And I tend to think that we should instead think about important research as frontier research. Research that moves the boundaries of our knowledge. And certainly, I think this is what we are going to experience today. I had the joy of being part of a lunch with the assessment committee, and I can tell you the philosophical frontier talks were already around the table. I understood almost all of what was said. Now,
in the Department of Philosophy and Science Studies, we are very proud that Claus today defends his doctoral thesis. And my job today is a little bit keeping track of the formalities, so I'll just walk you through the program and make sure that things are happening on time, and hopefully that we'll end in a good spirit and things are working out well for Claus. And we are most happy also to welcome the two distinguished opponents, Olivier Darrigol and Halvorson, who will be respectively first and second opponent. And I think with these words, I would ask Claus to come up here and then present his work. Thank you.
I will want to start to thank Søren Riis and the chairman of my evaluation committee, Patrick Blackburn, for their overwhelming support. Not today, but also the process, which has been quite long. And I will thank Olivier Darrigol and Hans Halvorson to act as my opponents. So this is the academic honor of my life. My talk is addressed to the public, so I have one equation in my talk. So Michael Friedman was a very prominent philosopher at Stanford, not only a philosopher of science. He actually had quite an impact in larger areas of philosophy. He wrote much about Kant. He died March 24 this year. So his conclusion is that the laws of physics acquire empirical content only under the condition of so-called constitutive principles that define inertial frames of reference. So in Newtonian physics, the three laws of motion. And those principles are a priori. What does that mean when you are Friedman? It means they are not empirical. They are not laws of motion, but they are called Newton's laws of motion. But he said, no, because they define inertial frames empirically. If we haven't fixed those inertial frames, then we can't make physics. We have no reference frames. And because it's their job, they themselves are not empirical in the strict sense. But the law of gravity, which then is true in an inertial frame, that's a real law of nature. So the constitutive a priori principles in Newtonian physics are the three laws of motion. And what Einstein's theory of relativity tells us is that those principles are only historically contingent. They are not true forever because, as I will tell you in the next part, we don't think that Newton's three laws of motion are true anymore. So constitutive principles of physics have changed In the history of physics, we call those revolutions, and that's exactly what happened in the shift from Newton to Einstein. So each physical framework, Newton's special relativity theory, general relativity theory, rests on its own unique set of constitutive principles, according to Friedman. There's only one way of empirically defining those inertial frames. Only the three laws of motion can do that, did Friedman claim. Because if it wasn't unique, I think he was afraid then people would say, if other principles can do the same job as Newton's, then Newton's principle, then it's just a matter of convention, whether we say Newton's principles are those that are empirical or those that are constitutive. So that's the whole issue. They have to be unique to be a priori. So those principles are not true forever in eternity, which Kant thought at Newton's time. They change in the history, but they are still, at the specific moment of time in history, they are still those that define inertial frames, and we, in that frame, say they are not empirical. Friedman's interpretation is that Einstein defined a new inertial frame of reference by elevating the light law to a constitutive principle. So what he did is he discarded Newton's second and third law. And then he was able to define new concept of space and time. But Henri Poincaré, he did actually the same, according to Friedman, within a Newtonian framework. So he made a classical version of electromagnetism and relativity, according to Friedman, that predicts exactly the same observable effects than Einstein's relativity theory. What do I think of this story? I have read Poincaré's original articles, and it is simply not historically true that Poincaré did preserve Newton's laws of motion. He discarded both Newton's second and third law. He kept the first law, but not the two others. And because you need those three laws to define inertial frames of reference classically, on Friedman's own terms, Poincaré's theory can't be a classical theory because he didn't define inertial frames the way Friedman told you people do in Newtonian physics. And for the second point, Friedman's constitutive principles are not unique. I have read other physicists who have shown me how to define inertial frames, both classically and relativistically, that work both in Newtonian physics and special relativity theory. And the most prominent is Vladimir Ignatowski. In 1911, only 6 years after Einstein's paper, he actually defined inertial frames by conditions that since space is homogeneous, it's boring, it's the same everywhere if you pull matter back and forth. And it's also isotropic, so if you take a experiment and rotate it, it will do the same. So if you take all matter that can influence each other and rotate the system, nothing new is going to happen. And that was enough to define inertial frames, according to Ignatowski. So no need to talk about Newton's three laws of motion. And so my conclusion is Friedman's principles do not satisfy his own criteria for the relativized a priori. They are not unique. The history of physics shows they are not unique. You just have to read quite a lot. So what do we know now? Let's move on to Darrigol. I have no picture of him. He is sitting right here. So instead of talking about constitutive principles, let's talk about comprehensibility principle. They appear natural to us at a given stage in the history of physics. Those principles possess a theory-generating deductive power, sometimes sufficient to produce entire theoretical frameworks. My best example in my thesis is Landau. So what are examples? Space is homogeneous and isotropic. So if you take all matter in the universe, in space, and move it, it will behave exactly the same way, because space is just boring, it doesn't do anything. And space is isotropic, the speed of light is the same in every direction. Time is homogeneous. If I perform an experiment tomorrow, if my experiment has something to do with temperature, of course it might give other results. But it's not because of time itself. So time is homogeneous, space is homogeneous and isotropic. The relativity principle I started is such a principle, according to Darrigol. And some would say, oh, this principle of least action, if you look at the mathematics, that's not so natural at all. But if you have a deep understanding of the principle of least action, you might say that it is a natural principle. It's uncontroversial at the time in physics. Those principles are wrong, according to general relativity theory. But it was very unnatural to question those principles. So, Poincaré through Darrigol. So, how did I interpret Poincaré through Darrigol? If you accept Maxwell's equation in the ether frame, and you accept the relativity principle, as everyone did, both principles, and some additional principles, like causality, then you must accept length contraction relative to the ether. So if something moves through the ether, it gets shortened. That's very strange, Claus and Poincaré. Yes, but do you accept this principle? Yes, I do. Or those natural laws? Yes, I do. Do you accept those principles? Yes, I do. Okay, then you are obliged to accept length contraction. That's the power of those principles. That's the rationality behind it. And you must abandon Newton's theory of gravity, because this theory can't be true in those new inertial frames of reference. Einstein through Darrigol. If you accept the light law in one reference frame, you just take the part of Maxwell's equation that matter to you and skip all the other equations. But in principle, it's the same starting point. If you accept this law and you accept the relativity principle, what did Einstein make out of this? You must accept not only length contraction, you also must accept time dilation. Time is not... If I move relative to you, we are not agreeing on how time goes. We can find out because we have mathematics to translate back and forth, but time is relative to the reference frame. And that's really strange. But if you accept those two principles and those additional, like everyone did, then you have to accept this. What did Einstein and Poincaré do after they published their paper on electrodynamics? Then they tried to make a new theory of gravity. They knew, okay, we must abandon Newton's theory of gravity if we still want to hold on to this principle. And it was the first thing both of them did. The first thing they did after publishing on electrodynamics was trying to figure out a new theory of gravity. Einstein succeeded, Poincaré died before, so as far as I know. And Landau is not so well known. What did he say, together with Lifshitz? If space is homogeneous and isotropic, time is homogeneous, and the principle of least action, then you must accept conservation of linear momentum and angular momentum. So the speed of a system will be conserved. In an isolated system, if I can accept that this is an isolated system, then it will behave like Newton's first law. And if the system is rotating, also then this rotation will stay the same. This you must accept from the other thing. And the cool thing about this one is those principles, they apply both to Newtonianism and special relativity theory. So we have a way of understanding what is common in those theories across the revolution. But if you then say, okay, no, mass is frame independent and constant, then you can derive Newton's three laws of motion. That is what Landau did. If you instead say, no, the speed of light is the speed of light is frame independent and constant, then you must accept special relativistic dynamics instead. So this is, I suppose, a very deep way of understanding the progress of physics. And there are no problem. Of course, there are revolutions, but people accepted Einstein's theory quite quickly, even if it was that strange. And this explains how they can do that. And now my time is...
Thank you. Sorry, I will be talking sitting because when I saw my name was in the title of the dissertation, I hurt my back. And so I have to be sitting. And I'm also should apologize if I'm not going to be as pedagogical as Mr. Festersen was, and I will allow myself to use some philosophical jargon, and I apologize for it. And so. My first remark is about that I think your dissertation is very well anchored in the history of philosophy, in the history of science, and also in the history of the interactions between science and philosophy. And I think you have been quite brave to defend a form of neo-Kantianism, and I congratulate you for that, because myself I'm very happy with that. And, but it's not easy, and when you do these sort of things, you are always vulnerable, I think, to all sorts of criticism. But I think it's worth trying. I'm convinced. Okay, this attempt by Friedman, which truly, I think, rightly attracted your attention, my point is well-informed, but surely not immune to criticism. And in your dissertation, you recall the criticism that was formulated against various criticism. And then your own approach, that I think the way you reason is that because Friedman was actually using history a lot to at least to comfort his views, and you decided, well, let's do the history, but let's do it more thoroughly and better than Friedman, and let's see if really Friedman's various theses agree with the history better done. The results was no. So, apparently. So what you did, and in fact, what really surprised me, because for a dissertation in philosophy of science, there is the part devoted to the history of relativity is huge, right? It's a huge portion of the dissertation, and you have done a very detailed and I think often quite insightful history of relativity. And from Lorentz to Ignatowski, and you have done so so well, I think, and so competently in every technical details that I think at least for certain episodes you have really improved on. Although there is, as you know, there is a massive amount of literature on the history of relativity. Sometimes a lot of contradictions between various historians. So you really have in all this, and you had to make your own selection. And not only that, but I think for some aspects, especially for Poincaré's work, or the famous Palermo memoir of 1905 or 6, precisely, your analysis goes, I think, in some respects further than anything available so far. And so you have done, I think, a quite impressive job. Just I think only the historical part of your dissertation is the dissertation within the dissertation, you could say, and worth praise in this regard. You, in fact, distinguish at least 3 different versions of relativity theory: Poincaré's, Einstein, and then Ignatowski, which is not special. But and then if you look at Poincaré's version, as you mentioned, Newton's laws are abandoned by Poincaré, and yet he maintained the Galilean space-time. So this contradicts Friedman's statements that Newton's laws are constitutive of the Galilean space-time. That's one of your remarks. Another remark is about Ignatowski. So the interesting thing with Ignatowski is that the same constitutive principles generate both the Galilean and the Minkowskian space. You obtain, one special, he has a general framework. In one special case is the Galilean, and the rest is Minkowskian. So from these two remarks, you can conclude very clearly that there is no one-to-one correspondence between the constitutive apparatus and the theory in Friedman's analysis. And then, as a corollary, it becomes difficult to, or a little problematic, to characterize the relativistic revolution as a change in constitutive principles if you don't really know what the constitutive principles are, and that's if you can pick them and choose them, these are not uniquely defined. Okay, so your idea is that you get better adequation with history. You should change, redefine the a priori you are using. You not use anymore the constitutive principles regarded, as preconditions of experiments in experimentation in the case of Michael Friedman, and adopt instead my notion of which I trace it to Helmholtz's analysis, for instance, of foundations of geometry. This notion of comprehensibility principles. So what are comprehensibility principles? So I will say it in my own words, since I'm the father of the notion. But they are simple, easily acceptable preconditions of measurability, causality, and correspondence. So it's very basic idea that if you want to understand the world in a precise and quantitative manner, you have to be able to measure things. You have to be able to, you need some sort of causality, which may be vaguely defined, but you will give it a sharper form according to the context in which you live. And you need also the idea of correspondence, the Bohrian idea. The idea that in general, in the next theory, you have to be able to use the knowledge you have acquired in the previous theory. And then, what did I do with those principles? Well, my own limited goal was to show some kind of necessity of the main theories of physics. When considering historical change, I've put much more emphasis on the modular structure of physical theory and not so much on the comprehensibility principle. And that's where, from the philosophical point of view, the originality, I think, of your dissertation comes, is you believe that, in fact, with this idea of a comprehensibility principle, it's not only a retrospective justification of theories or better understanding a posteriori of the structure of a theory, but it can also help to understand history, to understand the nature of change in the history of space and time, in the history of relativity theory in particular. And so your idea was to give your own identification of comprehensibility principle in the case of Galileo Newtonian physics, in the case of Poincaré, in the case of Einstein, in the case of Ignatowski and others, Landau, for instance. And then you observed, I think, three things by using this notion of comprehensibility principle, that these principles play an important, in history, an important constructive role, and that a change of principles may account for revolutionary change. Here you are actually, in a way, quite close to Michael Friedman, except that you have changed from the principles are no longer constitutive principles, but they are comprehensibility principles. And the second point is that, which is quite interesting, is that some principles, such as homogeneity, you mentioned in your talk, are shared, in fact, by the various versions of theory, and others are not. And so the sharing explains both the existence of different formulations of the same theories in history that we observe in history, as well as the fact that the same principles may cover different theories, as happened, for instance, with Ignatowski. The third point is that the principles can only be formulated and implemented in conjunction with what I call interpretive schemes, those blueprints you have of conceivable experiments. And this is another source for a variety of formulations of a theory. And I think this emphasis on the variety of formulation is a very welcome aspect of in theory, because both in the history and the practice of science, the availability of alternative formulations for a theory is usually quite important. from an operational point of view, how you apply the theory. It's easier to apply in one formulation or easier to conceive. It's also has to do with the psychology of the scientist and how he can think within one framework or another. So I think this whole aspect of your exploitation of the comprehensibility principle was in part unforeseen by myself, and I think it's quite clever, and it works on average. I think it was quite well, and I think I have to me, I would congratulate you for that. But I have those two criticisms. The first is that your arguments imply a definition of comprehensibility principles, which I think is quite a bit more elastic than my own. Because for me, comprehensibility principles, they are essentially, they should be expressible in terms of very simple operations. And not in terms of already advanced theoretical principles like the principle of least action. But I have to say that myself, occasionally, I've used the principle of least action as I've defined it also as a comprehensive theory as well. But as I think you very quickly mentioned in your talk, you can do so only if you have some background to justify the fact that it is a natural principle. And but it's true that if you look at the practice of theoretical physics nowadays, all over in fundamental physics, you have the least action principle is there, and it is truly regarded as some kind of a comprehensibility principle by physicists today. But why is it so? What is it that makes that you would need further justification? So this is not the end of the story. But there are also, for other principles that you pick, I think there is a similar difficulty, but I don't think it's fatal. I think it can be fixed and improved. My second remark is that all your arguments, they depend on the solidity of my own views. And one thing that surprised me is that I suppose it should be a pleasant surprise, but you never, in your dissertation, even start to criticize the notion I've proposed. You just accept them, right? And but I think that you actually, I would have welcomed some sort of criticism or attempt to consolidate my notions maybe and to define them more precisely, but you really do not do that. You focus really on the heuristic aspect, what you can explain with these notions in history. So again, I think this is one aspect of your dissertation that could be a work that could be further developed. Of course, by saying that, I'm doing my own criticism, and I'm just emphasizing the insufficiency of my own work rather than yours. But anyway, I will finish here, because, again, I want to congratulate you for the work you have achieved. First, the remarkable historical work that you have done, and the originality of your philosophical approach, and daring to criticize, like the kind of quasi-guru of neo-Kantianism who was Michael Friedman. I think myself, I knew Michael Friedman, and he's a very charming person in private, but I never dared to discuss with him my comprehensibility principles, etc. I had a lot of talks about Poincaré with Michael Friedman, but I never confronted him because I thought, that I was flatly criticizing his own notion, and I didn't dare. I was a little shy about that. Anyway, so and you were apparently you are not as shy as I am. But so anyway, I'm very happy that you did all this work. And
okay, so I will take just a little while to say a few things to contextualize the contribution that Claus has made to scholarship, the way I see it, and then I'll use that to lead into some more detailed questions that have been posed up until now about portions of the dissertation. None of these questions at all undermine the overarching quality of this contribution. And so I'm going to say my comments will be under three main themes about what this dissertation contributes. One theme is to the history of philosophy overall. A second theme is to the understanding of the relativity revolution, so what Einstein actually contributed to our understanding of the physical world. And the third thing is about methodology. So I'm going to start actually with that third thing, because I think it should not be taken lightly at all what an accomplishment this dissertation is methodologically. So we live in a world of, so as you can tell from my accent, I'm coming from the United States. And so I come with reports of, yes, it is as bad as it seems. We live in a world that's very polarized. And this is especially bad, sadly, in academia. So we see incredible polarization now between the sciences and the humanities subjects. And what this means is that people in general are not encouraged to contribute in areas that might be considered to be interdisciplinary. So it's very rare these days to see a dissertation that is knowledgeable about physics, knowledgeable about mathematics, knowledgeable about history, knowledgeable about philosophy, that brings to bear knowledge of several world languages and understanding texts and so on. So this is, I think, a massive contribution methodologically that couldn't be done by many people. So I just want to say that, Claus, I think that you should be very proud of. You've done something that I think truly only a handful of people in the world could do, if they even had as much dedication as you've had. Now, I think that's actually incredibly socially important, because we have to remember that the contributions to even the hardest of sciences, to mathematics, to physics, that they actually feed back into society. And of course, I don't just mean that in the American way of they feed back into society in terms of money. I mean that in the old European way of they feed back into society in terms of our self-understanding, our understanding of who we are as human beings, of what kind of world we live in, of what the whole point of our lives is. And so that it takes real interdisciplinary scholarship in order to be able to do this kind of thing. I'm sorry, I'm suddenly aware that I have no timepiece in front of me, and that's the worst thing a philosopher can ever happen to a philosopher, is not to be aware of what time it is and that time is passing. So you'll be grateful to know that I've now made myself aware of the time. Okay, so hopefully no relativistic effects will have a dramatic effect on this, so that my time will be the same as yours, to a first approximation at least. Okay, so that brings me then to talk about the history of philosophy and the contribution that Claus has made to that overall. And I'm going to be a little bit dramatic about this, because actually I think philosophy is very important. And I think that this particular kind of philosophy, that is philosophy that is incredibly knowledgeable about the details of science, is much more important than is recognized usually. Okay, so circa 1935. Now, of course, Europe had much worse problems than philosophical disputes at that time. Strangely enough, right, ironically enough, the United States at that time, things were actually pretty good. I mean, minus the stock market collapse that had recently happened. But here comes this young philosopher, Willard Van Orman Quine, fresh out of Harvard, and he goes over and hangs out with the logical positivists, and he's really slick. And he's like, I'm going to one-up you guys. I'm going to make your view even better. I'm going to make positivism great again. And so what he says is, actually, you thought there was this neat division between convention and then empirical knowledge. So in other words, the background framework that's adopted by definition, then the facts that we observe. And Quine said, I don't see where that line is, and in fact, nobody can make coherent sense of it, so there is no such line. And if you read early Quine, you read the famous Two Dogmas of Empiricism, it sounds, who could not be convinced by this? So slick, nobody can resist the argument. But what's the upshot? And Claus mentioned before an upshot that you apparently saw. That is, Quine's view makes mathematics and the knowledge obtained in physical science there's no line between them. So where does this mistake occur? And that's where Michael Friedman comes in. And my view is, actually, I think we're in early days, because I think Michael Friedman was a prophet in some sense of, hey, wake up. And what's the occasion for waking up? For many people, the occasion, it can just be common sense. So I promise you, there are people in the world, and maybe some of you are here, you tell them Quine's view, and they may not be scientists, and they'll just go, ha, 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 boy, that's stupid, right? So I don't need to be convinced. I know he made a wrong turn because I know the conclusions are not right. And if that carried the day in typical philosophy classrooms, that would be good enough. But it took Michael Friedman to say, wait, actually, 99% of science is not like that, right? Something else is going on, because the physicist who you can trust to a great degree that they know what they're doing, for the typical physicist, and I'm now taking some liberties in reporting Michael Friedman's views, sort of the casual version of Michael Friedman, is the physicist is taking some liberties to decide that some things are on the table for confirmation or disconfirmation, while other things are not. So they just don't accept the Quinean view that everything is on the table at once. Quine calls this the web of belief. So everything is on the table at once. There's no way to distinguish between things that are being held fixed, so like your a priori background knowledge, and things being tested. So Friedman says, no, let's actually look at what has happened in the history of science. Now, this book, The Dynamics of Reason, the focus is primarily on relativity, because relativity was the problem case. So the relativity was what looked like it undercuts, it takes away the Kantian a priori. So that was my trajectory, the history of 20th century philosophy. Friedman, I said, was a bit of a prophet. I think he offers a very important corrective to what Quine said. I think he offers a corrective that methodologically is much more healthy for the interaction between philosophy and the sciences. I don't think today we would have a good conversation about philosophy's relationship to physics if this were being dominated by a Quinean framework. So the Friedman is pushing us back toward a methodology where to talk about issues in philosophy, we need to be faithful to the record of what happens in physics. Now, I'm setting aside again here, I don't know what to say about, what kind of methodology is this? Claus was being very humble earlier, saying, like, I don't really feel like I'm necessarily arriving at a final philosophical position or something like that, but I think nonetheless this is exactly what needs to be happen. We all have implicit views of what's happened in history that inform our philosophical views, and they better be harmonious with each other. And I just think the Quinean view is just not harmonious with the historical record. Now, what Claus has done, so this was an occasion for a little bit of a chuckle before, but I think it's also deadly serious. It's deadly serious that more people are not engaging with what Friedman said. Sadly, what's happened is Friedman, in many ways, is a defector from the analytic philosophy tradition. Now, it's interesting, he defected late enough in life so that he still has the clarity of an analytic philosopher, but he also has too much knowledge of history and of science to count as a really sort of proper analytic philosopher. So it's a little bit, he's fallen, I guess as you say here in Denmark, between the stools a little bit. And so it's really a big contribution that Claus has made by engaging critically with Friedman. Now, this leads to one question which I have my one other thing to say about special relativity before I pose some specific questions. But I think a question that hopefully I can ask Claus to address later is what does he think we ought to do next with this? Because I think the upshot is not, it might have sounded like to many of you, the upshot of this is Friedman is knocked down, right? So Friedman, but I actually don't think that is the upshot. I think Friedman is, and I think Claus indicated this, Friedman was very receptive of this kind of criticism. I think the idea is there needs to be some adjustments made in the Friedman view. We're not going back to Quine. We're not saying Friedman is wrong, therefore there's nothing like constitutive or comprehensibility principles. So that, I think that's one of the most important questions is where do we go next from this? Okay, so the last sort of narrative point that I want to make is about the interpretation of special relativity. Now, one thing I like very much about Claus's thesis is that it reminds us that special relativity was born out of a real struggle with understanding of how to describe phenomena in different reference frames. And at one point in the thesis, Claus says, Einstein gave us a way to understand the relativity principle metaphysically instead of epistemologically. Now, I don't think you meant that in the way that a typical analytic philosopher would mean it. So I actually want to start by asking you what you actually think is the lesson. Do you now think we have a better sense of what we should say if we can say, and I'm sorry, I'm borrowing this word, the lesson, actually is a Niels Bohr. He'd love to say this about himself, but I think it's actually a nice way to put things. So Bohr talks about the epistemological lesson of quantum physics. But what is the lesson? I leave out the adjective epistemological because I don't know if it's epistemological or metaphysical or something else. Having done all this research and having seen in a clear way what Einstein's distinctive new contribution was, do you think we can say now more clearly what the lesson of relativity is?
What is the lesson?
And it doesn't need to be a big word thing. It can be lessons. Lessons, like what are some of the new insights? And I mean, imagine we're your physics students, right? So what do you think we come away with now we see this in a new way?
What I gained doing this work was that it's a point from Darrigol that in the history of at least this particular science, the idea that this holism exists is not true. If I thought Friedman had no merits, I wouldn't have used 20 of my summer holidays. But in my view, he is too much Kuhnian at that point. He thinks too much in paradigms, which can be troublesome because then we get this problem that people think that I don't need to listen to you because you're just a physicist, or that people don't take science serious. And the real problem is, which I haven't discussed in my thesis, but that's the reason why relativity is so important. If philosophers and historians of science can't agree on relativity theory, why should anybody believe that we should believe in science across the board? Of course, we have to be skeptical at some points. But so that also has been my driving force to show that the progression of science in this particular history is rational. It could have been otherwise if it hadn't been Einstein or Poincaré or who knows. But there was a direction. There was not everything goes or we can't agree, and that's the reason why Poincaré is for me much more important than Einstein.
Okay. Also, somewhat tangentially related to that, but so there's a sort of I'm not sure whether it's a myth, but it's like many people say that Lorentz relativity, which I mean I think I read from your thesis that does not even really a very well defined term because it was sort of a moving target, right? Lorentzian relativity was, or like Lorentz's theory with the ether, that's like constantly changing, right? There's no ever stable one theory. But I've often heard, actually, this is in Schlick's book about relativity, Schlick says relativity with ether is empirically equivalent to relativity, Einstein's relativity. So he says empirically equivalent, there's no measurement that will detect one as
yes, but then you have to accept that it's the ether that causes time dilation.
Yeah.
And of course you could do that. And the last sentence in my thesis, I say the idea that matter and time and space have something to do with each other. If you say matter or ether, it doesn't actually make a difference. So it's if you think that Poincaré was totally crazy, then general relativity is totally crazy. So that can't be, that's not a good argument to say that Poincaré was on the wrong footing, that he's kept his ether, or because Einstein did something even more crazy afterwards.
So in your view, general relativity in a way is almost like a return to the ether a little bit, because matter becomes essentially an ether, matter distribution.
Yeah, it could at least look that way.
Along the lines of comprehensibility principles, so this is now, I'm just going to be honest of the sort of, maybe you're ignorant too, and we can, in good philosophical spirit, share ignorance on this. But homogeneity and isotropy as either constitutive principles or comprehensibility principles. So what do we do about the fact, or what do we do about the fact that we no longer believe those are true? So, I mean, we don't think space is homogeneous on the whole because we think that the space-time is affected by matter distribution. And so, like, I mean, well, first of all, look, even right around me, it's not homogeneous, right? Like, I mean, yes, space itself feels homogeneous to us, but the fact is, we have lots of models of general relativity where it's not. So what does that say about it being a comprehensibility principle?
In my view, it's just saying that if you want to build a theory, you have to make assumptions.
Okay.
You can't do it out of the blue.
Yeah.
For Poincaré, it was a matter of principle.
Yeah.
From his geometry, space can't be.
Yeah, and so that's one reason he wouldn't have accepted general relativity, right?
So the problem with how do philosophers of science normally do their work?
Yeah.
They take fixed theories, but the problem is not to understand fixed theories. The problem is to understand how we got there.
Yeah. So my sense is that Friedman. This is more sort of anecdotal. I mean, Michael Friedman was a very important figure in some ways. I said he fell between the stools, but in other ways, and he has a small group of fans, right, who sort of know what had been doing. And the rumor was that Michael Friedman became more and more Hegelian over time, so that he wanted progression of paradigms to be sort of this like Hegelian rational sequence of history. Do you think that comprehensibility principle? Because look, I think anyone who's practiced any science knows that's really not the way things work out. Like, you actually have to make choices in science, right? You have to non-trivial choices, right, about which experiments you're going to do and when to accept a theory and so on. Do you think comprehensibility principles are more faithful to that sort of openness of scientific development?
Yes. I've tried a little bit to look into the history of the principle of least action. If you hear the principle of least action for the first time, you think, okay, should that be natural? But if you read Langshot, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but then you see, okay, it comes out of the work principle. So if you look at the history of this principle, then you can see that, okay, it wasn't that strange an idea to start with, and therefore it ended up being non-controversial for most physicists. Yeah. And if you will understand why they don't think this idea is controversial, there maybe philosophers and historians can contribute to explain, okay, we ended with this crazy idea.
Yeah.
How on earth did we get there? In a way that makes sense. It doesn't need to make sense in terms of comprehensibility principles.
Yeah. So it seems
in principle, someone could just say, "Whoa, I have a good idea." Boom! I write down all Maxwell's equations.
Yeah.
And if the world behaves like that, what's not to like? And that makes historian and philosophers of physics obsolete in some way. If you look at how it really worked, it wasn't that way. So we do not run out of work. But in principle, it could happen.
I like to think that the philosopher of science is actually just like saying out loud what happens in their head, when they're doing science, right? Because, so the thing is, unless someone has pretty radical views, scientists are conscious, they deliberate, they make choices, they have freedom, and we all find ourselves in these situations day to day, not necessarily in scientific practice, and so we're just as philosophers reflecting on, and I don't think we normally think in everyday life that every situation I face there's a unique rational choice, but we also think they're often bad choices. There are often less optimal choices and more optimal choices, and so we think, we should probably talk about science that way. Whereas it's not an inevitable progression.
No,
in a sort of Hegelian fashion, nor is it this like Feyerabend-style chaos of like there's no rhyme or reason. There's some sort of middle, you see. And I think your thesis makes that case very well, because I think you opened up, for me at least, that there actually were lots of sort of strings that could have gone further, but some died for, actually literally Poincaré died, right? So whatever thread he was developing, it just sort of got cut off there, right? But there were many options open in some sense. So it seemed to me like you were maybe not this extreme, but almost making a case that relativity wasn't inevitable the way we have it today.
Yeah, and what I'd also tried to show is that, yes, okay, most people, they read Einstein's 1905 paper, and then, okay, check, Lorentz, he derived the Lorentz transformations, we are done. But if you look at the practice of science, why on earth did this one paper, this Ignatowski approach, why on earth did he write a paper on special relativity in 1967? It's just to say from an occasional point of view, we are not finished with special relativity.
That's another thing I think is great about your thesis, is that there's a lot to learn still about this theory. I would love to discuss Ignatowski more with you now, because I think it's another unique contribution you make, but I think I'm probably better to say I'm satisfied with your responses, and probably the audience is satisfied with hearing me comment.
To the rotation committee.
So, perhaps I should just read the document that we signed, that on 15th of October 2025, Claus Festersen defended his doctoral dissertation, Relativity and the A Priori, Reconsidering Friedman's Dynamics of Reason in the light of Darrigol's Comprehensibility principles in relation to the requirements of the Danish degree Dr. Phil, Doctor of Philosophy. The official opponents have decided that they have found the defense of Claus Festersen's dissertation satisfactory. Well, that's what the official... Congratulations. Congratulations.
Congratulations. And thank you for your